It was 1918. World War I was coming to an end, and few could have imagined that the millions of victims would be surpassed many times over by another catastrophe. The Spanish flu, the deadliest pandemic of all time, a disease that infected 1 in 3 people on the planet and killed over 50 million people within a few months. We'll take a deep look at the whole incident. Where did the disease come from? How did it spread so widely? And could it have been prevented? Or could the whole thing have been prevented? It is still not known exactly who was the first infected, what caused the pandemic, and where exactly it broke out. According to more recent theories, it could have been as early as 1916 or 1917. It could have come from birds or pigs, and could have spread from China, as well as from the giant military camp of Oedipals, in the hinterland of the French front, where Allied soldiers from all over the world were concentrated, from Europe, from America, and from Italy. But the story is usually told like this. It all started on March 4th, 1918, at the Fort Riley military camp in American Kansas. Here the soldiers were preparing to land in Europe. Albert Gitchell was a camp cook. That day he reported sick with the classic symptoms of a normal flu. Fever, sore throat, muscle pain. Nothing would be so strange if it hadn't looked like this in the camp within 6 days. 522 infected, 46 of them have already died. And that's including poor Gitchell. The incubation period was a minimum of 1 to 3 days. After a few days, as if with a classic flu, there was a slight improvement, and then such severe pneumonia set in that the sick were generally suffocating in their own blood. It was clear to everyone that they were dealing with an incredibly aggressive disease. Really, already on March 10th, people are infected in New York and soon in all US states. At a time when there are no antibiotics yet and quarantine is almost non-existent, it is no wonder, and it will get worse. American soldiers are flocking to the European front in large numbers. Ships are arriving in Europe with loads of seriously ill people, and the overcrowded military camps in France and England are a breeding ground for the spread of infection. The situation is such that an American deployed in Europe in the spring of 1918 is more likely to die from a new disease than from combat. Doctors are at a loss. Maybe it's a new form of pneumonic plague, they think. They are trying brutal doses of the new drug aspirin, but they don't yet know that even an overdose of acetyl salicylic acid is fatal. So often the sick are essentially killing without knowing it. There are also reports that the German army used the virus as a biological weapon and spread it to the enemy ranks. The truth is, however, that the disease is also rampant among non-Germans. The soldiers may have contracted it from their opponents during heavy fighting in the underground tunnels of the Hindenburg Line. And then it goes fast. Eastern Europe, Northern, Southern Europe. A special chapter is Spain, where as a neutral country there is no press censorship. So while the newspapers of the warring parties do not write much about the infection, so as not to undermine the fighting morale. In Spain, the press is just teeming with terrifying stories about the deadly disease. From here, the later named Spanish flu also spread, because thanks to the undistorted reports, it seemed that the situation in Spain was the worst. But that is not true when in the summer of 1918, the Spanish flu hits with a second wave. The whole planet is already affected. Really, completely the whole. They say that the only area where the Spanish flu did not hit is the island of Marajó in the Brazilian Amazon River Delta. Otherwise, the virus kills everywhere. In Alaska, entire villages disappear from the map. The Pacific island of Samoa is a tragic record holder. 30% of all residents die. The probability of death from infection was 10 to 20%. Some infected people were lucky. For example, American President Woodrow Wilson, or later President Franklin D. Roosevelt, survived the disease. German Emperor Wilhelm II, writer Franz Kafka recovered, or Hollywood magician Walt Disney. Others were not so lucky. Fortunately, the pandemic left as quickly as it had come. By the spring of 1919, there was no trace of the infection. For decades, scientists were puzzled by what actually happened. The virus killed in a completely different way than the regular seasonal flu. While the latter takes its toll on infants and the elderly, The Spanish flu killed mainly young and healthy people between the ages of 20 and 40, and then pregnant women. They had a 70% chance of dying. The answer was only partially obtained in the new millennium. From a tissue sample of victims who were buried in the frozen ground in Alaska, the Spanish flu virus was isolated. It is called H1N1. When the virus was tested on monkeys, it turned out that instead of the upper respiratory tract, it settled directly in the lungs. And what's more, it was able to provoke an extreme response in the immune system. So paradoxically, those with better immunity reacted worse. The H1N1 virus then returned in the 1970s in Russia, and then again, in the recent epidemic called swine flu in 2009. Panic shook the globe at that time, but the death toll was ultimately not nearly as horrific as in 1918. Thanks to much better conditions and a greater vaccination campaign, around 20,000 people died. Scientists are warning that a pandemic of rapidly mutating influenza viruses affects humanity every 30 to 40 years, and that in the future we will have another serious one. Even the common seasonal flu kills up to 500,000 people in the world every year, without anyone noticing it. Thanks for watching. You can subscribe, like, and so on. You know it. See you next time.